Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Gimel, and Yirz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Tzadik Aleph Amid Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the very top line of the Shulchan Aruch on Kuf Tzadik Aleph Amid Beis, Siman Shin Mem Sif Ches. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanesudim Batzaro Bashivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Bein Bayabasha, Hamakom Yerachem Aleihem, V'yitziam Yitzar L'Rvacha Me'afelo La'oiro Mishibud L'Geula, Hashta Bagala V'zman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schus Refuah Shalema for Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malka Chana, Gila Shifra Bas Ilana Udal, Yitzchak ben Sin ben Dusha, Rivka Bas Shiraleah, and Chava Hadassah Bas Serel. They should all have a Refuah Shalema B'Sar Shar Chayle Yisrael. So let's pick up here with Sif Ches, top line, Kuf Tzadik Aleph Amid Beis. Says the Mechaber, Muchin. What are Muchin? Well, let's take a look at Mishnah Berurah Oiskat Lamed Aleph. Muchin, Kol Davar Rach, any kind of soft materials, Kari Muchin, are called Muchin. Kegain, for example, Tzemer Gefen, cotton, Ugariras Begadim Beluyim, shredded pieces of worn out clothing, Ukahai Gavna, other such materials, Vahuadin Noitzos. The same halacha would apply to feathers, and as we're going to see right now in the Mechaber, what the Mechaber is addressing is stuffing, the type of materials that you would use to stuff up a pillow, to make cushions out of. So says the Mechaber Muchin, these kind of soft fabrics that you're going to use to stuff a pillow, stuff a mattress, shenaflu min hakeses, and they fell out of the pillow, or they fell out of the quilt, they fell out of the mattress. Mutter lahachaziram, you're allowed to restuff the pillow. So you had a stuffed pillow, the stuffing came out. On Shabbos, you're allowed to take the stuffing, and you're allowed to restuff the pillow. Aval also litneim betchila bakeses. However, you're not allowed to stuff the pillow for the first time on Shabbos. So you go and you stitch out a pillow. This pillow has never been stuffed before, so this has never been a pillow yet. Now you want to open it up, you want to take stuffing, and you want to put the stuffing in. Now you're making a pillow. To put the stuffing in for the first time would be a problem of makeh b'patish. You're making a keli, tikkun maneh. You're going ahead and you're turning something into a pillow. You're making a pillow for the first time. But if you have a pillow and the pillow opened up and the stuffing came out, then you're not making a pillow. This is not makeh b'patish. You have a pillow. The stuffing came out of the pillow. You're restuffing the pillow. That's the halacha that the Mechaber is telling you here. There's an interesting Meiri. The Meiri says, obviously the Mechaber felt he had to tell you this halacha, right? He had to tell you that you're allowed to restuff it. There would be a havamina that you can't restuff it. What would the havamina be? The havamina would be, maybe when the stuffing comes out, it's no longer a pillow. Maybe it's an ois pillow. And now you're making the pillow again by restuffing it. Says the Meiri, that's the chiddush of the brisa. This is not the Mechaber's a chiddush. This comes from a brisa in Masechta Shabbos and Daf Mem Ches Amud Aleph. You can see that in the Be'er HaGoyla. Says the Meiri over there, the chiddush is that it doesn't become ois pillow. And we don't look at it that now you're making the pillow. No, it already was a pillow. But to do it for the first time, that you're not allowed to do. That would be makeh b'patish. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kan Lamed Beis, muter lachziram la'oisai hakeses. You're allowed to return the stuffing to that pillow. Dekeven dekvar hayusham, because since the stuffing was already in the pillow previously, ein bazeh mishum tikkun maneh, this does not present a problem of tikkun maneh or makeh b'patish. Ach sheyizoher shelo yitvar. However, you do have to be careful. You go and you restuff the pillow. Why did the stuffing come out? Maybe the stuffing came out because the seam split. You have to make sure that when you restuff the pillow, you don't end up breaking out a needle and thread and doing teifer and sewing the pillow closed. Obviously, that would be an issa d'oraisa. Oiskad Lamed Gimel, you're not allowed to put the stuffing in betchila for the first time. Tahashta avad leimoneh. Because by putting in the stuffing, you are turning it into a keli, you're making it into a pillow. V'yesh pazeh chiyuva daraisa. That would actually be an issa daraisa of makeh b'patish. There is an interesting Dirshu footnote here. Dirshu footnote number 73. And it's an interesting shaila that comes up. And that is when a kid has an inflatable ball. You have a beach ball and you want to blow up the ball. So we're talking here about a pillow that gets stuffed with muchin. It gets stuffed with, soft fabric. We're saying that if the pillow was never made before, when you stuff it, you turn it into a pillow. Well, how about an inflatable ball? If you have an inflatable ball, when it's deflated and it's flat, it's not a ball. When you stuff it, how do you stuff it? With air. When you inflate it and you fill it up with air, you're turning it into a ball. Is that an issue? So in footnote number 73, they bring down over here from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Zechet Tzadik Levracha, Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said, "She'em kfar nifchu oisai pamachas." If the ball had already previously been inflated before Shabbos, then if it's deflated on Shabbos, mutter lachzor lenafchoi, you're allowed to go and you're allowed to blow it up again. Why? Because Rav Shlomo Zalman Zechet Tzadik Levracha is looking at this in the same way as the Mechaber is looking at the pillow. Now, you'll ask me, well, the pillow had stuffing, the stuffing came out, you're taking the stuffing, you're returning it to the pillow. The ball, the air came out, the air is gone. Now you're putting in new air. Okay, the place can talk about this. All the air is one air. That's what some of the places can want to say, that there's no such thing as different air, whatever that means exactly. Or you could just say that it doesn't matter if it's different air, if it's the same air. The bottom line is that the first time you inflated the ball, you turned it into a ball. So you're right. The very first time you blow it up, it was never a ball. So when you blow it up, makabapatish, you're turning it into a ball. Once it was blown up once, when the air comes out, it's a deflated ball. But it already was a ball. So it's not makabapatish. The same way, returning to the stuffing to the pillow is also not makabapatish. And I believe that this is the accepted psak. There are poskim that differ. There are poskim that hold that you're not allowed to blow it up, even if it was blown up before. But I believe that for the most part, this is the accepted psak, that if a ball had been inflated before Shabbos, you're allowed to inflate it on Shabbos, and it's not makabapatish. Moving along to Siftes. Says the Mechaber, second line down. Aser lekabetz melach mimisrefais hamelach. There's an Issa d'Rabbanan. Aser over here means an Issa d'Rabbanan. There's an Issa d'Rabbanan to collect salt mimisrefais hamelach. What's misrefais hamelach? Well, the shirish of the word mimisrefais is saraf, which means to burn. Mimisrefais hamelach is what is called a salt pan or an evaporative pool. That's where they take salt water and they allow salt water to collect in a shallow, wide pool where it's exposed to the sun, and the sun burns, so to speak, the water. It evaporates out the water from the pool, and then you're left with dry salt at the bottom of the pool. So that's what misrefais hamelach are. Says the Mechaber, you're not allowed, there's an Issa d'Rabbanan, to go ahead and collect the salt from the evaporative pool. You're not allowed to go and collect the salt from the pool. Why? Says the Mechaber, shedoime lema'amer. This is an Issa d'Rabbanan because it is similar to the av malacha of ma'amer. What's ma'amer? Ma'amer is when you go out to the field and you collect the grain and you go and you make it into a big heap. You make it into a big pile. So you have the produce is out in the field, and one of the steps in taking care of your produce and harvesting your produce and bringing it in is you've got to go out to the field and you've got to do ma'amer. You've got to go collect all the grain into a nice big pile. That's ma'amer. What are you doing when you go and you collect the salt from the salt pool? Well, you have this pool, the water evaporated out, you've got the salt, now you've got to collect the salt. Now, collecting the salt is not ma'amer daraisa. The reason it's not ma'amer daraisa is because salt is not gedulei karka, and the av malach of ma'amer only pertains to gedulei karka, like wheat, barley, other grains. It does not pertain to salt, which is not gedulei karka. However, this does bear similarity to the malacha of ma'amer, because even though the salt is not gedulei karka, but you've got this area, this pool on the ground, where before there was no salt, the water evaporated out, now you have salt, and you're going out and you're collecting it. It bears enough similarity to ma'amer that Chazal saw fit to make an issa d'Rabbanan. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Kat Lamed Dalet, Mimisrafais HaMelach, Sheyesh B'kaimais, there are places, Shamamshech L'Soichan Mayim, where they draw water into a pool, Min Hayam, from the salt water of the sea, V'achamos Arfasan, and then the sun burns or evaporates out the water, V'hei Nasin Melach, and then you're left over with salt. This is also with Rabbanan Eis Katlam and Hey Shedoime the Malachas Ma'amer who less if Hashibolin. What is the malach of Ma'amer? It's to go out to the field and collect the sheaves and the stalks of grain. V'gam hu ke'ein zeh. This is very similar to that. Therefore, it's an issa d'Rabbanan. Now, the Mishnah Berurah points out v'dafga b'mkaim hamisrifos. This issa d'Rabbanan only applies to the evaporative pool, the salt pan, where they go and they evaporate the water and they create the salt. Sheshamuhu makam gidulai shel hamelach, because that is, so to speak, the makam gidulai, the place where the salt grows. Now, the salt doesn't grow, obviously, but that's where the salt is generated. That's why it bears similarity to ma'amer. You do ma'amer out in the field, which is the makam gidulai of the grain. Over here, you're collecting the salt in the salt pan, which is, so to speak, the makam gidulai of the salt. That's where you generate the salt, by evaporating out the water. Dumya d'shibolin shabasadeh. So it's very similar to gathering the sheaves and the stalks out in the field. Avalim nispaze b'makam acher. But if salt got scattered somewhere else, if you dropped a box of kosher salt in your kitchen, then mutar lekaptzon l'makam echad. You're allowed to go pile it up. There would be no issue of ma'amer. So again, the issa d'oraisa of ma'amer is on gedulei karka. We're making an issa d'Rabbanan over here on salt, even though it's not gedulei karka, but only when you're gathering it together, so to speak, b'makam gidulai. But if it's not b'makam gidulai, then we do not have such an isser. This is doima lama amr, the mechaber said, ulekach also b'drabanan, and therefore it is an isser d'Rabbanan. Aval imur gufaleka, but it's not the isser d'oraisa of ma'amer. Dein imur elo b'gedulei karka, because the av malacha of ma'amer d'oraisa only applies to gedulei karka. Continues the mechaber in Siftes, second line down near the end of the line. V'chein, and similarly, aser, and over here, aser means midaraisa. The first aser in this sift meant midrabanan. This aser means daraisa. Now the Mishnah Berurah is going to jump on this, and the Mishnah Berurah is going to ask right away, why did the mechaber use the phrase aser, the phraseology? Aser. It shouldn't say aser, it should say chayiv. Right? You would be chayiv chatos. It's a daraisa. If you did this b'shogeg, you'd be chayiv chatos. Aser usually connotes on this darabanan, and especially in this sif, in the beginning of the sif, we used aser for a darabanan. Now we're using aser for daraisa. So the Mishnah Berurah is going to jump on that, and the Mishnah Berurah will explain it. But says the mechaber v'chein, similarly, aser, there is an issa daraisa lekabetz kol davar mimakam gidulai. The issa daraisa of ma'amer is to go ahead and collect anything mimakam gidulai, where it grows. So you have cucumbers that grow out in the field. Even if the cucumbers were already picked, you're not allowed to go gather up all the cucumbers and make a big pile of cucumbers. That would be ma'amer. That's collecting something and piling something up, gathering it together, b'makam gidulai. That would be an issa d'oraisa, because now we're talking about gidulei karka. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cotton Lamed Zayin, Kol Davar. You're not allowed to collect anything. B'makam gidulai, says the Mishnah Berurah, what's anything? Hainu peiros, fruits. So you have apples. Apples fell off the tree. Even if they fell off the tree before Shabbos, so they're not muktzah. Right? An apple that started Shabbos on the tree, if it was on the tree ben hashmashos, it's muktzah, and migudis katzoyla ben hashmashos is katzoyla kula yuma. But let's say it was already off the tree when Shabbos came in. Now you want to go out Shabbos afternoon, you want to pile up, you want to gather together all the apples. Mokum gidulai karka, that would be an Issa Daraisa of Ma'amer. Hainu peros, fruits, v'yerakos, vegetables, cucumbers, ve'etzim va'asavim, even wood and grass. So you have lots of twigs outside on the ground. You want to go outside on Shabbos and gather them together. Now, first of all, the etzim would be muktzah, etzim v'avonim, the muktzah makmas guvay, but there would also be an issa daraisa of ma'amer to gather them together, or asavim, or grasses, the chol davar agadol min hakarka, anything that grows from the ground. L'chayra, by the way, it just struck me now, right? To go take a rake. Well, I would think go take a rake and rake up your leaves into a big pile on Shabbos. L'chayra, that would also be ma'amer. I'm not sure if that would be Ma'amer Daraisa or not. I have to look into the specifics. I have to remember the specifics of the Av Malacha of Ma'amer. Why do you pile leaves? You pile leaves so that you could gather them up and you could dispose of them. You don't gather them up so you could use them. Okay. Tzarech Yoser Iyun, I have to look into that. Okay, so, but in any case, said the Mishnah Berurah, I knew peris v'yerakos v'eitzim v'asavim v'chol davar agadol min hakarka. Ubazeh chiyuv nami ikka kimisha bekabtzam b'makom gidulam tezeu meleches ma'amer gufa. Over here, there would be a mamshin issa daraisa chiyuv chatas if you did it b'shoigig. You gather up fruits, vegetables, says wood, grasses. This is mamish ma'amer gufa. It's ma'amer 101, and this would be an issa daraisa. Now, telling you that it's in Issa Daraisa, so why did the Mechaber say Aser, which connotes a Derabanan? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Lahayrais lanu. The Mechaber wanted to teach us something here. The Mechaber wanted to tell us, this is Aser. Lahayrais lanu, dishaloi b'makom gidulan. If you gather up produce, but you do it shaloi b'makom gidulan, kigoyin shenispazru peres babayis. Let's say apples spilled out in the kitchen, right? Apples on the ground outside by the apple tree. That's ma'amer daraisa. What if the same apples already were brought into the house and they spill out in the living room? And now you want to go collect the apples in the living room. Is that ma'amer? Is that an issa daraisa? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Afilu isura nami leka kivisha mekabson yachad. This would not even be an issa darabanan to go ahead and gather them up. In other words, the Mishnah Berurah's problem with the Mechaber was, the Mechaber is talking about an Issa Daraisa of Ma'amer, going and collecting produce, Gidulei Karka, outside in the field, B'mokum Gidulan, is an Issa Daraisa. So why does the Mechaber say Aser, which sounds like a Darabanan? Says the Mishnah, I'll tell you why. Because he wanted you to know that there is something else that is not even Aser. This is Aser. It's us. Not only is it Aser b'Drabanan, it's a Chivchatos, it's a Daraisa, right? But infer from the Mechaber's use of the word Aser that this is Aser, something else is not even Aser. It's not even Aser b'Drabanan. What's that? Gedulei karka shaloi b'makom gidulei. The apple spilled out in the kitchen, it's not Makom Gidulai. Over there, it's not even Aser. Makom Gidulai is Aser. Not only Aser, it's Chiv Chatas. But Shaloi b'Makom Gidulai is not even Aser. There isn't even an Issa D'Rabbanan. Now, the Chayodam says the reason why there isn't even an Issa D'Rabbanan is because what would the Issa D'Rabbanan be? We're afraid that if you're going to gather up the apples in the kitchen, you're going to come to gather up the apples in the Sadeh, in the apple orchard. Chayodam says that wouldn't be an appropriate gezerah. He brings rice from other places. Mokom b'mokom loy michlif. We're not concerned that if you're allowed to do it in one type of mokom, you're going to come to do it in another type of mokom. There's a clear distinction between outside in the field and inside in the kitchen. So Chazal weren't afraid that there would be such a mistake. They didn't feel that they had to make such an Issa D'Rabbanan. Now, the Mishnah Berurah does throw in here, V'ayin le'el siman shin lamed hey sif hey. Now, in shin lamed hey sif hey, we learned that there are times when something like produce spills out that you're not allowed to go ahead and collect it up, but not because of the Issur of Ma'amer. We put restrictions over there in shin lamed hey Are you allowed to gather up the apples and put them in a bag? Are you allowed to gather up the apples and put them in a box? So in Shin Lamed Hey, Sif Hey, Ayin Sham, we have restrictions on what you're allowed to do, but not because of Ma'amer. The restrictions over there are because of Uvda D'Choil. So different, yes, there are some restrictions. Even Shaloi B'Makam Giduloi, because of Uvda D'Choil, Ayin Sham. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'Shomer Gino Yisu Pardesim, the people who guard and watch over gardens and orchards, tzrichin lizar ma'od bazeh. They have to be very careful about that. This is a daraisa ma'amer. Afilu b'perish and nashru min ba'od yom. Even if the pears fell off the tree or the cucumbers fell off the vine min ba'od yom before Shabbos, if they were attached to the tree when Shabbos came in, Ben Hashmashas, Friday evening, so then they're even also betiltled and they're muktzah. But even if they fell off the tree Friday morning or Thursday, you're still not allowed to collect them on Shabbos because it's gedulei karka b'makom gidulei. It's in this daraisa ma'amer. Shaloi la'asvan b'Shabbos afilu ma'at ki yesh bazeh chiyuv chatos. The sheer imur here who sheer katan ma'oid, because you'll say, well, is it a problem to take 3 or 4 apples outside in the field and gather them together? Says the Chavetz Chaim, be really careful, because the minimum share of ma'amer is very, very small. U'k'moshe kasav Rambam, ha'ma'amer ochlin, if you're gathering together edible produce, im la'achila shiura k'gregeres. The minimum share is the size of a dried fig. V'im lebehema, and if it's for animal fodder, shiura k'maloi pihagdi, enough to make a mouthful for a young goat. If it's you're collecting wood for firewood, enough firewood that you can make a fire to cook an egg. So it doesn't take a lot to be over the Issa Daraisa of Ma'amer. Ayin Sham. Moving along to Sif Yud, 3 lines down, says the Mechaber, Hamekabetz Devela. If somebody takes dried figs and he takes them and presses them together. Dried figs are mushy, sticky, right? When you force them together, they form a cake. So says the Mechaber, Hamekabetz Devela, if you press together dried figs, v'asa mimenu igul, and you make a round cake of dried figs of Elam Mitzias fame, so Hamekabetz Devela v'asa mimenu igul, you should knock out te'enim, or you make holes in figs. V'hichnis hachevel bahem, and you go and you thread them, you thread a string through the hole in the figs. Ad sheniskabtzu guf echad, and you do this, so you make a string of these figs, and you tie it, and that also presses them together, and they become one piece. Harezeh toledes ma'amer, this is a toilada of the malacha of ma'amer, the chayiv, and it's this daraisa chiyuv chatas if done b'shoigig. The chein kol kayotza bazeh. The same halacha holds true by anything similar to this. Now, what's the chiddush over here? We're talking about the malacha ma'amer. We just discussed ma'amer. Ma'amer 101: go outside to the sadeh, makom gidulai, gather up sheaves or stalks of produce, make a pile. You've got the malacha daraisa ma'amer. Go out to the apple orchard, gather up the apples, make a big pile of apples. You've got the yisr daraisa of ma'amer. Comes along the mechaber says this is also ma'amer. To press figs together and turn them into a guf echad, make a cake of figs, this is also ma'amer. Says the Mishnah Berurah Kalam Ches Harezeh Toledes Ma'amer. Shedarkon shel oisan haperos lechabram ba'ofen zeh. This is the format of ma'amer when it comes to these kind of peros. The format of ma'amer over here is not making a pile. The format of ma'amer when it comes to wheat, when it comes to grains, the format of ma'amer is to make a big heap, is to make a big pile. By these kind of figs, that's not the format of ma'amer. The format of ma'amer is to press them together and form them into cakes. So the Mechaber is telling me that is the ma'amer of figs. Now there's another big chiddush here. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Nishmas Adam. Take a look at the Nishmas Adam. Shemitzadeh, who takes the position, da'af kisha oisekein babayis chayv mishum ma'amer. We just finished saying, when do you have ma'amer da'araisa? Ma'amer da'araisa is when you do it in the sadeh. When you do it b'makom giduloi, that's when you have ma'amer daraisa. Says the Nishmas Adam, there's another chiddush here. The chiddush over here is that making a cake of dried figs is also ma'amer. Now, you don't make the cakes of dried figs b'makom giduloi. How do you get dried figs? Well, the figs grow on the tree. You harvest the figs from the tree, and then all over Shas, we have who knows how many Gemaras that talk about taking the figs, the hella oisam legag. They bring them up to the rooftop, and they spread them up out on the roof, exposed to the sun to dry them. That's not makom giduloi. The rooftop is not makom giduloi. Now, when they're dry, you're going to take them and you're going to press them into figs. You're not going to do it b'makom giduloi. You're no longer b'makom giduloi. So how do we have ma'amer daraisa? The answer is, says the Nishmas Adam, you have to understand the underpinnings of the malach of ma'amer. The reason why ma'amer daraisa is b'makom giduloi is because that's ma'amer kedarkoi. The normal way to do ma'amer when it comes to produce like grain is to make a big pile out in the sadeh, which is makom giduloi. To do it somewhere else, that's not ma'amer kedarkoi. That's not ma'amer daraisa. But with something like dried figs, it is ma'amer kedarkoi. Because first you have to collect them and you have to dry them. And then after you dry them, you combine them into cakes. That is the ma'amer of dried figs. And the ma'amer of dried figs is not done b'makom giduloi. So that is ma'amer daraisa. The ba'ifid kazeh also lasis gam b'bayis kibasada. It's done in the bayis, it's done on the gag, the same way it might be done in the sadeh. But it does not have to be done in the sadeh, and it's not shaloi kedarkoi if it is not done in the sadeh. V'chein kasa b'sefer ma'aser rikeach ayin sham. Moving along to Sif Yud Aleph, 3 lines off the bottom, near the end of the line, says the Mechaber. Af al pi shenoistim shum shemim ve'egoizim lidvash. Even though on Shabbos you are allowed to take sesame seeds and you're allowed to put them into honey, you're allowed to take egoizim, you're allowed to take nuts, and you're allowed to put them into honey. What's the chiddush in that? The chiddush in that is that there's no isser of lush. We don't look at combining sesame seeds in honey as being lush. Why? Because the sesame seeds don't combine through the agency of the honey. They don't, it's not like flour. Flour, you have something which is individual grains, albeit very small, right? So, they're loose, not diverse. The right word is escaping me. They're loose, distinct. They're loose and distinct particles that when you add a liquid agent to them, they combine. They're no longer distinct particles. That's not what happens when you put sesame seeds or nuts into honey. You still have distinct particles. They just happen to be stuck together because of the honey. But they're distinct. So that's not lush. So you're allowed to put sesame seeds into honey. And we had this halacha earlier. You're allowed to put sesame seeds into honey. You're allowed to put nuts, even chopped nuts. You're allowed to put them into honey. I mean, not ground, maybe if they're really fine, maybe you can start having a problem. But pieces, you're allowed to put them into honey. But, says the Mechaber, even though you're allowed to put them into honey on Shabbos and there's no problem of lush, lo yechabtzeim biyadai. Now on Shabbos, you're not allowed to go ahead and put your hands into this sesame seed honey mixture or honey and nut mixture and collect nuts, collect shumshimin, and take them out of the honey and squeeze out honey. That you're not allowed to do. Why? Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah is cut lamites. Lo yechabseim biyadai ritzoyna loymar. What the Mechaber means to tell you you're not allowed to do, shemahadik biyadai ha'egoizim. You tightly squeeze the nuts or the sesame seeds in your hand. Val yedei zeh mafrid hadvash mibachutz. What you're doing is you're now separating the nuts or the sesame seeds from the honey. You're squeezing out the honey. They have a Berurah. Now you have a Berurah problem. That's the problem here. It's a Berurah problem. Like you're separating the nuts from the honey. In Mishnah Berurah, Ice Cut and Samach Vav, Sheberarnu Davar Zeh. Over there, we'll see that there are times that you're allowed to do this. If you're taking oichel mitoich apsilis, if you want the nuts, if you want the sesame seeds and you don't want the honey, so then when you take the nuts or the sesame seeds and you squeeze it to remove it from the honey, you're taking oichel mitoich psilis. If you're doing it miyad because you want to eat it right away, and you're doing it biyad, you're doing it with your hand, so then the taka would be mutter. But if you're doing it lachazman, if you're doing it because you want to make a nice jar of sweet sesame, sweet nuts, but you don't want it floating in honey, so you're separating it from the honey to put it away in a jar, then it's lachazman. Then it's aser b'shum Berurah. Okay, let's just do Sif Yud Beis over here, which actually has no Mishnah Berurah on it. Says the Mechaber Hanoisin Zera Pishtin Oishum Shemin V'Kiyotze Ben B'Mayim. If you put flax seed or sesame seeds into water, chayiv mishum losh. Then you are chayiv because of losh. Chayiv is a daraisa. Mipnei shem misarvim v'nislim zeh bazeh. Because, says the Mechaber, the nature of sesame seeds, the nature of flax seeds, is that when you put them into water, they do combine. You're no longer going to have distinct particles. They will combine, and that would be a problem of lush. Okay, we're going to stop over here. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael, the Rosh Hashanah should send Yeshuas, Refuas, Parnasa, Sheduchim, to all you need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Gal Tzedek, B'mher of Yameinu Amen. Be well.